The night was alive with the sound of clinking glasses, the low murmur of conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter echoing through the chandelier-lit halls of Alexander Grant's mansion. The millionaire had spared no expense for his dinner party, filling the room with politicians, business tycoons, and celebrities who hung onto his every word. Yet beneath the polished marble floors and golden accents, an air of arrogance lingered like perfume, as if the house itself had absorbed Alexander's pride over the years. He thrived on control, on bending people to his amusement, and tonight would be no exception. Alexander raised his glass with a theatrical flourish, his sharp eyes scanning the guests as though searching for his next performance. He thrived on spectacle, on moments that would etch his name deeper into the minds of others. As conversations hushed, he called for silence, his voice commanding yet laced with playful menace. The guests turned toward him, their expressions a mix of admiration and curiosity, unaware of the storm about to unfold. Alexander was hunting for entertainment, and he had already chosen his target. Miguel Torres, the gardener, stood at the edge of the grand hall, nearly invisible among the tailored suits and glittering gowns. His shirt was simple, his hands rough from years of labor, yet there was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. Alexander's eyes locked on him, and with a smirk that hinted at cruelty, he beckoned Miguel forward. A ripple of surprise spread among the guests. Why would a man of such wealth and power drag his gardener into the spotlight? The silence grew heavier, anticipation thickening the air like smoke. When Miguel stepped forward, his expression was calm, almost unreadable, though his dark eyes revealed a flicker of awareness. He knew this was no invitation. It was a trap disguised as theater. Alexander, savoring the tension, leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine slowly, before setting the glass down with deliberate care. Then in a voice dripping with mockery, he said, "Tell me, Miguel, do you think you're clever? Do you truly believe a man who prunes hedges could outwit someone who built an empire from nothing?" The room stirred with gasps, whispers darting like shadows. Miguel did not flinch. His silence alone seemed to unnerve some of the guests, though Alexander remained smug, convinced of his superiority. Then, with the precision of an actor delivering his most dramatic line, Alexander threw down his challenge. "If you're as smart as you think, prove it with a bet," he declared, his grin sharp as a blade. "Outthink me, and I'll give you something you'll never forget." The words sliced through the room, igniting laughter and disbelief from the audience. The contrast was too absurd. A millionaire against his gardener. The hall erupted in reactions. Some chuckled at the absurdity. Others whispered their disdain for Alexander's cruelty, while a few leaned forward eagerly, hungry for entertainment. Miguel stood in the center, steady as stone, his posture neither defiant nor submissive, but quietly resolute. He was not a man used to standing in such lavish halls, yet he did not shrink under the weight of their stares. For a brief moment, it felt as though the roles had reversed. Alexander craved attention, but Miguel now held it, simply by refusing to break. Alexander's grin faltered for the briefest instant, though he quickly masked it with a scoff. He had expected immediate panic or stumbling words, but instead, Miguel's silence unsettled him. To cover the unease, he turned to his guests and spread his arms as though presenting a circus act. "Come now, don't be shy, Miguel. Surely you have something to say." The audience leaned closer, their curiosity clawing at them. What could the gardener possibly do? The stakes had been set, but no one yet knew the rules of the game. And so the night hung on a knife's edge. The bet itself remained undefined, the promise of something unforgettable dangling like bait in the air. Alexander reveled in the tension he had created, convinced this would end as another anecdote to inflate his ego. But among the guests, a spark of intrigue began to grow. Who was this quiet gardener who faced humiliation without fear? Miguel's silence spoke louder than words. And though no one could yet see it, the first cracks had formed in Alexander's carefully constructed world. Miguel let the silence linger a moment longer, as though weighing the weight of the challenge before him. The guests leaned forward, expecting him to falter, to stammer out an excuse, or perhaps bow his head and retreat. Instead, he lifted his chin slightly, his posture steady, his eyes fixed on Alexander with an expression that was neither defiance nor submission. It was something far more unsettling: composure. The murmurs began to fade as people realized he wasn't going to crumble. His calmness itself became an answer, louder than any laughter in the room. When Miguel finally spoke, his voice carried a measured firmness, the kind that demanded attention without raising in volume. "I accept your bet," he said evenly, his words slicing through the air with the weight of conviction. There was no tremor, no hesitation, just the steady tone of a man certain of himself. The hall fell silent again, the absurdity of what they were hearing dawning on the guests. For a gardener to accept a challenge from a millionaire was bold enough, but the confidence with which he spoke left many unsettled. The tension thickened, and eyes darted between Alexander and Miguel, searching for cracks in either man's facade. A smirk tugged at Alexander's lips, his amusement resurfacing now that Miguel had taken the bait. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, as though preparing to savor the entertainment to come. Yet just as the crowd prepared for a humiliating end, Miguel added another sentence that shifted the room's energy entirely. "But the terms," he continued calmly, "will be revealed when the time comes." The air changed. Guests glanced at one another with widened eyes, struggling to process what they had just heard. The audacity of such words was almost incomprehensible. A man of low station had not only accepted the challenge, but had dared to set a condition of his own. Whispers erupted instantly, spilling through the crowd like sparks. Some muttered about his arrogance, others about his bravery, and a few wondered if perhaps Miguel knew something they didn't. The room buzzed, caught between ridicule and curiosity. Alexander's smirk widened, though behind it was the faintest flicker of intrigue. He thrived on power games, on controlling the terms of every encounter. Yet here was Miguel, standing calmly in his tailored shadow, refusing to let Alexander dictate every move. The millionaire tapped his fingers against his glass, pretending to be unbothered, though the gesture betrayed his growing curiosity. "Very well," he said with deliberate slowness. "Keep your little secret. It won't save you when the time comes." Laughter rippled again, but it sounded thinner now. Miguel did not return the mockery. He bowed his head slightly, as if acknowledging Alexander's words, then stood tall again, his gaze unwavering. There was no need for him to shout or defend himself. His composure was enough to unsettle the room. The longer he remained calm, the more his silence carried weight. Some of the guests who had laughed earlier now leaned back, suddenly unsure. It was not the reaction of a man walking willingly toward humiliation. It was the response of someone who held a hidden card close to his chest. The whispers continued to grow in intensity, spilling into corners of the grand hall. Some questioned who Miguel truly was, if perhaps his past was not as simple as tending gardens. Had Alexander underestimated him? The uncertainty gnawed at their curiosity, making the spectacle even more enticing. The guests weren't just watching a bet anymore. They were watching a mystery unfold, one that promised either the spectacular ruin of a gardener or the unthinkable embarrassment of a millionaire. Either way, the drama had already taken root. Alexander, however, seemed unwilling to let doubt settle for long. He leaned back in his chair with exaggerated ease, swirling the wine in his glass before drinking deeply. To him, Miguel's calm was nothing more than bravado, a thin mask waiting to crack. "Enjoy your moment," he said, his voice dripping with confidence. "When this is over, you'll wish you had stayed in the shadows where you belong." Miguel neither flinched nor replied. His silence became his weapon, a quiet defiance that echoed louder than threats. And for the first time, Alexander's laughter didn't drown out the unease in the room. The party carried on with music and laughter, but the air no longer felt carefree. In the corners of the mansion, away from Alexander's polished smile and Miguel's silent defiance, whispers began to circulate. Guests leaned closer to one another, voices low and urgent, their curiosity too strong to ignore. The gardener had spoken with such certainty that it seemed impossible he was merely a man of dirt and shears. There had to be more to him, something hidden beneath his quiet demeanor. A mystery had slipped into the heart of the evening. One rumor suggested that Miguel had once been a student of engineering, brilliant enough to impress his professors, but too restless to stay confined within the walls of academia. The story went that he had abandoned it all, his studies, his potential career, his future, to disappear into a simpler life. No one could agree on why. Some said it was tragedy, others insisted it was betrayal, but none could explain how a man who might have built bridges or machines ended up trimming hedges in Alexander's garden. Another whisper painted Miguel as a man carrying secrets too heavy to share. A guest claimed he had been seen reading late at night, studying old blueprints by candlelight in a small cabin near the estate. Others swore he was a recluse who never spoke about his past, never bragged, never revealed his ambitions. His silence, once dismissed as humility, now appeared to be something deliberate, a shield to protect truths that no one else could quite piece together. Every guest added fuel to the fire of speculation. The staff had their own stories. The butler, with years of service under his belt, recalled how Miguel once repaired an irrigation system in hours when a team of professionals had failed for days. The maid spoke of his uncanny ability to fix anything, from broken clocks to faulty wiring, without ever asking for help. They whispered that Miguel's hands were too skilled, his mind too sharp, for someone who was supposed to be nothing more than a gardener. It no longer seemed absurd to think he was hiding a past life. Alexander, at first dismissive of the chatter, began to notice it too. He caught fragments of conversations as he passed groups of guests, their eyes darting nervously as if caught in forbidden speculation. At first, he laughed it off, insisting Miguel was nothing more than an employee with a talent for trimming roses. But the more he heard, the more he found himself unsettled. Could it be that the man he had mocked in front of everyone was not the simple servant he believed him to be? The seed of doubt grew quietly within him. Alexander prided himself on knowing everything about those in his orbit, friends, rivals, employees alike. Yet here was Miguel, a man who had worked under his nose for years, and suddenly the room buzzed with stories Alexander had never bothered to ask about. His arrogance began to falter as he wondered what kind of opponent he had just invited into a bet. He still believed victory was inevitable, but for the first time, the path to it felt uncertain. Meanwhile, the guests couldn't let go of the puzzle. The question of Miguel's true identity spread like wildfire, keeping them hooked to the unfolding spectacle. They no longer cared solely about Alexander's grandstanding or the wealth displayed in the mansion. They wanted answers about the quiet man who had stood with such composure. Each whisper carried the same undertone. There was more to Miguel Torres than met the eye, and they were desperate to know what it was. Yet despite all the rumors, one truth remained. No one knew what the bet actually was. Miguel had accepted without defining the terms, leaving a shadow of mystery that unsettled even the boldest voices in the room. Guests speculated about money, skill, or knowledge, but nothing seemed certain. The uncertainty gnawed at them, turning the bet into something larger than itself. It wasn't just about a challenge anymore. It had become a story of pride, secrecy, and the possibility that the gardener might not be as ordinary as everyone believed. When Miguel finally broke his silence and asked for something, the request seemed almost laughable. He wanted access to the old greenhouse at the far edge of the estate, a place long forgotten and overtaken by weeds. Dusty glass panes stood cracked, vines twisted across rusting frames, and the air inside smelled of damp decay. To most, it was a ruin unworthy of notice, a relic left to rot. Yet Miguel's voice carried certainty when he claimed this was what he needed for the bet. Guests stared in disbelief, unable to understand why he would choose such a place. Alexander erupted into laughter the moment the words left Miguel's mouth. The millionaire slapped the table, mocking the gardener openly, declaring that the game had already been won. "The greenhouse," he sneered, his tone heavy with sarcasm. "If that's where you'll stake your dignity, then so be it. Take it. I won't waste my breath on broken glass and dirt." To him, Miguel's request was a sign of weakness, proof that the man had no real plan. He agreed instantly, dismissing the challenge as meaningless theater. The following morning, Miguel stepped into the greenhouse with tools in hand. Dust coated the floor in thick layers, cobwebs hung heavy in corners, and what little sunlight filtered through the cracked glass was dim and uneven. But rather than looking defeated by the ruin, Miguel walked the space with steady determination, observing every detail, as though he saw potential hidden where others only saw waste. He began to clear the debris, moving with the patience of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Over the next few days, a rhythm emerged. While the mansion bustled with its usual routines, Miguel disappeared into the greenhouse at dawn and often stayed there long after sunset. The staff carried trays of food for him, but he barely paused to eat, consumed by his work. From the outside, the only clues to his progress were the faint clinking of tools, the sound of glass being shifted, and sometimes the glow of lamplight deep into the night. The greenhouse had become his world, sealed off from curious eyes. Guests who had stayed after the party grew restless. Some wandered near the greenhouse hoping to catch a glimpse, but Miguel had locked the doors and covered the glass with cloth. This secrecy only fed speculation. What was he building? What was so important that he guarded it so carefully? The more people speculated, the more suspense grew. The gardener who once blended into the background had become the center of attention, his every movement shrouded in mystery. Alexander, meanwhile, paid little attention at first. He mocked the guests who whispered about Miguel's late hours, insisting the man was probably wasting his time, sweeping dust and chasing illusions. "A greenhouse cannot defeat me," he declared, convinced the challenge was nothing more than a fool's errand. Yet late at night, when he walked past the glowing windows, a quiet unease gnawed at him. The thought that something meaningful might be taking shape inside was a possibility he refused to admit aloud. Inside, Miguel worked tirelessly, his hands moving with precision as he repurposed broken materials and salvaged forgotten tools. He cut away rot, repaired the shattered frames, and polished the glass until light once again streamed through. But there was more to it than mere repair. Miguel was designing, creating, transforming. His focus was absolute, his every action deliberate. Alone in the silence of the greenhouse, he was building something none of them could yet imagine, and he seemed to carry the weight of a hidden purpose. As the days passed, suspense grew unbearable. Guests whispered that the gardener was crafting a masterpiece, while others dismissed it as madness. But whether they believed in his vision or not, everyone waited for the moment when the doors would finally open. Each day, Miguel emerged dirt-streaked and silent, giving nothing away. The tension thickened, pulling everyone into the mystery. Whatever he was preparing inside that forgotten greenhouse, it was no longer just a bet. It was a promise that something unforgettable was coming. Word spread quickly through Alexander's circle, and within days, the mansion was once again brimming with guests eager to witness the conclusion of the strange bet. Invitations, carefully worded by Alexander's staff, promised an evening of spectacle and certainty of his victory. Carriages and sleek cars lined the driveway, the wealthy and powerful stepping out dressed in finery, their eyes alight with curiosity. The air carried a charge of excitement, but also unease, for no one quite knew what Miguel had been crafting in secrecy. Inside the grand hall, Alexander commanded the room with the same arrogance as before, pouring drinks, greeting his guests with smiles laced in superiority. He repeated to anyone who would listen that nothing Miguel could possibly do would be worthy of applause. A gardener cannot outshine a man who has conquered markets and built empires, he declared, raising his glass high. The guests laughed, though their laughter felt thinner than before, like a veil covering a growing doubt they couldn't dismiss. When the time came, all eyes turned toward the far end of the estate, where the neglected greenhouse had stood silent for days. The guests crowded near the path, their footsteps crunching over gravel, hushed voices weaving theories and expectations. Then, from behind the closed doors, Miguel finally emerged. His shirt was torn, his skin streaked with dirt and sweat, but his posture was upright and his gaze steady. He looked nothing like a defeated man. Instead, he carried the kind of calm that unsettled even Alexander. The crowd fell into silence. Miguel said nothing, but his quiet composure spoke volumes. He wiped his hands slowly against his trousers, then placed them behind his back, standing still under the weight of so many eyes. His presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere. There was no arrogance, no theatrics, only a sense of grounded certainty. Alexander, watching closely, felt something he had not anticipated. A ripple of unease that stirred beneath his confidence, as if the ground beneath his feet had begun to shift. Everyone seemed to hold their breath at once. The air was heavy, thick with suspense, as though the night itself was waiting for the doors of the greenhouse to open. Alexander forced a smirk, determined not to show doubt, but the grip on his wineglass had tightened. The guests leaned forward, hearts quickening, hungry for the reveal, and in that charged silence, Miguel's calm confidence became more terrifying than any boastful declaration, because it hinted that what lay inside was greater than anyone dared imagine. The moment arrives with a silence so heavy that even the rustling leaves outside seem to pause. Miguel, without grand gestures, opens the greenhouse doors. What once was a neglected, dusty corner of the estate has now become a living sanctuary. Inside, vibrant plants stretch toward the sunlight, intertwined in a perfect balance of growth. A system of recycled pipes carries clear water across the room, nourishing both vegetables and flowers. The air is rich with oxygen, fresher than anything outside. Guests step closer, their eyes widening as they realize this is no simple arrangement of plants, but a vision of ingenuity. The astonishment spreads like a wave. Miguel had not only restored the greenhouse, but had reinvented it. Everything inside has been built from discarded materials, scraps that the wealthy family had considered worthless. Old bottles form irrigation channels. Broken tiles create walkways, and rusty frames now support vines heavy with fruit. What once symbolized waste has become a masterpiece of utility and beauty. Murmurs ripple through the crowd. Admiration, disbelief, even shame for having underestimated the quiet gardener. For many, it is the first time they see true creativity born from humility. Alexander, usually so quick with mocking remarks, can only stand frozen at the edge of the crowd. His face shifts from arrogance to disbelief, then to an almost desperate anger as he searches for a flaw, but none appears. Every corner of the greenhouse speaks of balance and resilience, each detail a reminder that genius does not always come dressed in wealth or power. As Miguel explains in simple words how the system sustains itself, Alexander's shoulders slump. He knows the bet has been lost, not just in results, but in dignity. The silence around him is louder than any insult. The guests exchange glances, each of them reflecting on what they are witnessing. Some are touched by the beauty of the creation. Others feel a sting of guilt for dismissing Miguel so easily. The lesson is clear. True talent often hides in plain sight, ignored by those too blinded by status. Conversations turn into whispers of awe, stories already forming in their minds about this moment they will never forget. Even the youngest guests sense the gravity of the scene, realizing they are witnessing more than a gardener's work. They are seeing a quiet revolution against arrogance. Miguel does not wait for applause, nor does he crave recognition. With the calm dignity that has carried him through, he wipes his hands on his worn trousers and slowly walks away. Behind him, the guests remain captivated, their whispers filling the air like an echo of revelation. Alexander avoids their eyes, his humiliation complete. while Miguel disappears into the fading light, carrying nothing but his silence. Yet that silence speaks volumes, heavier than any speech or triumph. The greenhouse remains behind him, alive, thriving, and forever a symbol of humility defeating pride.